This is going to be the conclusion of our series on Joseph from the book of Genesis, and I want to recap a little bit what's happened to Joseph so far, because this is a long story. It's going to be a long reading, but let's all get on the same page. Joseph was a young boy. His brothers didn't like him. His father liked him the best. His brothers took him and threw him in a pit, and then they sold him into slavery. This is the short version. Sold him into slavery. He ended up in Egypt. He was lifted up as a slave. He was doing really well. Then he got tricked and he got thrown into jail. Even in jail, he got lifted up, and then he started interpreting dreams for people, interpreted dreams for the Pharaoh, and then the Pharaoh lifted him up even more and made him kind of his king, second king sort of thing. So what he had predicted, and where we ended last week, what he had interpreted Pharaoh's dream as, was that there would be a great famine throughout the land, and that's where we ended. And so now we're in the famine. So that's where we're starting. And again, it's a long story, long reading, so buckle up. When Jacob, that was Joseph's father, found out there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you just sitting there staring at one another? I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down and buy some so we won't starve to death." 10 of Joseph's brothers went to Egypt to buy grain. But Jacob did not send Joseph's younger brother Benjamin with them. He was afraid that something might happen to him. So Jacob's sons joined others from Canaan who were going to Egypt because of the terrible famine. Since Joseph was governor of Egypt and in charge of selling grain, his brothers came to him and bowed down with their faces to the ground. They did not recognize Joseph, but at once he knew who they were, though he pretended not to know. Instead, he spoke harshly and asked, "Where do you come from?" "From the land of Canaan," they answered. "We've come here to buy grain." Joseph remembered what he had dreamed about them and said, "You're spies. You've come here to find out where our country is weak. I'm going to find out the truth. I swear by the life of the king that you won't leave this place until your younger brother comes here. Choose one of you to go after your brother while the rest of you stay here in jail. That will show whether you're telling the truth. But if you are lying, I swear by the life of the king that you are spies." Joseph kept them all under guard for 3 days before saying to them, "Since I respect God, I'll give you a chance to save your lives. If you are honest men, one of you must stay here in jail, and the rest of you can take grain back to your starving families. But you must bring your youngest brother to me. Then I'll know that you are telling the truth, and you won't be put to death." Joseph's brothers agreed and said to one another, "We're being punished because of Joseph. We saw the trouble he was in, but we refused to help him, and he begged us. That's why these terrible things are happening." They did not know that Joseph could understand them, since he was speaking through an interpreter. Joseph turned away from them and cried. But soon he turned back and spoke to them again. Then he had Simeon tied up and taken away while they watched. Joseph gave orders for his brothers' grain sacks to be filled with grain and for their money to be put in their sacks. He also gave orders for them to be given food for their journey home. After this was done, they each loaded the grain on their donkeys and left. Now, in between this part of the reading and the next, there's a journey home and another journey back, and there's more imprisonment and more drama. They had brought Benjamin to Egypt, and he was now in prison. This is the youngest child. And in the following reading, Judah sort of sums up their conversations and where they are now. So continuing in chapter 44. Judah went over to Joseph and said, "Sir, you have as much power as the king himself, and I am only your slave. Please don't get angry if I speak. You asked us if our father was still alive and if we had any more brothers. So we told you our father is a very old man. In fact, he was already old when Benjamin was born. Benjamin's brother is dead. Now Benjamin is the only one of the two brothers who is still alive, and our father loves him very much. You ordered us to bring him here so you could see him for yourself. We told you that our father would die if Benjamin left him, but you warned us that we could never see you again unless our youngest brother came with us. So we returned to our father and reported what you had said. Later, our father sent us back here to buy more grain, but we told him, we can't go back to Egypt without our youngest brother. We will never be let in to see the governor unless he is with us. Sir, our father then reminded us that his favorite wife had given birth to 2 sons. One of them was already missing and had not been seen for a long time. My father thinks the boy was torn to pieces by some wild animal. And he said, I am an old man. If you take Benjamin from me and something happens to him, I will die of a broken heart. That's why Benjamin must be with us when I go back to my father. He loves him so much that he will die if Benjamin doesn't come back with me. Sir, I am your slave. Please let me stay here in place of Benjamin and let him return home with his brothers. How can I face my father if Benjamin isn't with me? I couldn't bear to see my father in such sorrow." Since Joseph could no longer control his feelings in front of his servants, he sent them out of the room. When he was alone with his brothers, he told them, I am Joseph. Then he cried so loudly that the Egyptians heard him and told about it in the king's palace. Joseph asked his brother if his father was still alive, but they were too frightened to answer. Joseph told them to come closer to him, and when they did, he said, Yes, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Don't worry or blame yourselves for what you did. God is the one who sent me ahead of you to save lives. There has already been a famine for 2 years, and for 5 more years no one will plow fields or harvest grain, but God sent me ahead of you to keep your families alive and to save you in this wonderful way. After all, you weren't really the ones who sent me here. It was God. He made me the highest official in the king's court and placed me over all of Egypt. Now hurry back and tell my father that his son Joseph says, God has made me ruler of Egypt. Come here as quickly as you can. I will take care of you during the next 5 years of famine. But if you don't come, you and your family and your animals will starve to death. All of you, including my brother Benjamin, can tell by what I have said that I really am Joseph. Tell my father about my great power here in Egypt and about everything you have seen. Hurry and bring him here. Joseph and Benjamin hugged each other and started crying. Joseph was still crying as he kissed each of his other brothers. After this, they started talking with Joseph. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We don't have... In the essential Calvin and Hobbes, y'all remember Calvin and Hobbes? Best cartoon ever. Calvin says to his tiger friend Hobbes, "I feel bad that I called Susie names and hurt her feelings. I'm sorry I did it." And Hobbes says, "Maybe you should apologize to her." And Calvin thinks for a minute and he says, "I keep hoping there's a less obvious solution." Sometimes we have to be really, really desperate to actually apologize, don't we? And it seems like Joseph's brothers were about that desperate in today's story. I've sort of recapped the story for you, but I'll recap today's version so we're on the same page. There's this famine, and as Joseph had predicted, and in Egypt and all the lands surrounding Egypt, there was this horrible famine. And the brothers finally decided they would bring money to Egypt to find food because they've heard there's food there. They get there, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And he says, "You're spies." He throws them in jail, sends all of them back except for one with food and the money they had brought to spend on the food. Eventually, they run out of food. They have to go back for more, but Joseph had said, "Don't come back without your brother Benjamin." They bring Benjamin, and this time Joseph puts them through another elaborate thing. We didn't even read that part today, but there's this silver chalice, and it goes on and tells them he's keeping Benjamin there, and they beg him not to. This would kill their father if they returned without their younger brother. And finally, Joseph breaks down and reveals himself to them. There's a lot. It's an epic story. But the question that really hit me in Joseph's story this time is this: how in the world could he forgive them? They literally threw him in a hole, sold him into slavery, and told his father that he got killed by wild animals. Why would he forgive that? In reading and listening to this long story today, I wonder when that forgiveness actually happened, because for the first 9/10 of the story, he's still not very kind and he's not very trusting. He could have revealed himself to them right away, but that's not what happens. Instead, he takes various people prisoners, he sends them back and forth, he tries to make them think they're in trouble because they've stolen this silver chalice. He does all kinds of things that show little to no forgiveness. But somewhere along the line, maybe not until the very end, something happens. Something in Joseph is changed. One theologian says this about that kind of forgiveness: what occurs when I forgive another person, it does not mean that I can forget what he did to me. It just can't do that. No, when I forgive another, I myself step into the breach and say to myself, the same thing that made the other person mean, hateful, and guilty toward me is in my heart as well. Ultimately, we are two of a kind. I know from looking at myself how fickle and wicked the human heart is. When I forgive another person, I share the burden of his guilt. I become his brother and his sister, a burden bearer at his side. Joseph has had to realize, once again, the state of his own heart. He's had to recognize that the kind of evil that he's experienced lives in his own soul as well. And I wonder if maybe the act of imprisoning his brothers and mentally torturing them and inflicting pain upon them opened his own eyes to the fact that he could have been in their place as well. The theologian says he shares a burden of their guilt. He's choosing to do that. And Christ says that when we do that, when we understand the pain we experience is a share of the world's pain, and the guilt that we bear is a share of the world's guilt, and when we cast that pain and guilt on Jesus, then our burden will lighten. Forgiveness is beyond some nice words. It's even beyond acts of kindness. It's about healing pain and healing relationships. That's what we see here. We see Joseph and his brothers weeping and holding each other and finally talking with each other as siblings rather than as servants and master. Real trust is restored. I don't know how good I am at this, and I don't know about you either. I'm frankly lucky that I haven't had the kind of hurts in my life that I know that some of you have. But regardless of the situation, even with less severe offenses, forgiveness can seem impossible on our own. Another scholar writes, it's so crucial to see our forgiving not simply as our own act, but as participation in God's forgiving. Our forgiving is faulty. God's forgiving is faultless. Our forgiving is provisional. God's forgiving is final. We forgive tenuously and tentatively. God forgives unhesitantly and definitively. After all, our forgiveness is only possible as an echo of God's. Maybe that's how Joseph managed it, and the brothers too. Maybe they forgave each other by realizing the great forgiveness that God offers. No doubt there's someone you need to forgive in your life, and you can remember that too, and let God walk with you in that forgiveness. It will lighten your burden in life and allow you to live hopefully and joyfully. I don't know if you'll remember any of this sermon, but maybe you'll remember this quote that I read lately. The measure of our faith should not be whether we love Jesus, but whether we love Judas. The measure of our faith should not be whether we love Jesus, but whether we love Judas. Can you imagine any greater forgiveness than that which Jesus had for the one who betrayed him? We are invited to share in that sort of forgiveness, to walk into the breach with Christ and to allow his presence in our own forgiveness. Joseph forgave his brothers. He loved them. Jesus forgave Judas, just as Jesus forgives each of us when our thoughts and words and actions are evil. May we walk forward with him in love and forgiveness of each other. Amen.